Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Welcome to the webinar from National Forest Inventories to European level forest monitoring. The new EU Forest Strategy 2030 stated that the European Commission will put forward a legislative proposal for a forest observation, reporting and data collection framework, an EU-wide integrated forest monitoring framework. The purpose of this webinar is to continue the discussion on how the National Forest Inventories can contribute to a European level forest monitoring system. The webinar topics cover the potential of National Forest Inventories in monitoring biodiversity and climate change impacts at the European level, as well as on how to use NFI in strategic forest planning and decision support. This webinar is jointly organized by the Natural Resources Institute Finland, Luke, and ENFIN, the European National Forest Inventory Network. We are very happy that this webinar received over 250 registrations representing the academia, industry, the ministries, the European Commission bodies, international organizations, NGOs, to just mention a few. We would like also very welcome our participants overseas. Good morning to you. Next slide, please. In the first part of the webinar, we will listen to 5 presentations from the ENFIN members, after which we have 2 presentations from the European Commission bodies, followed by a panel discussion. We would welcome your questions after each presentation in the chat. We will deal with your questions in the panel discussions. So very welcome. I'm Markus Lier. I'm with the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Finland, and I have the pleasure to lead you through the seminar. Something on the in-house rules, we would like to ask you, due to the large number of participants, to keep your microphones and cameras off. Please enter any questions in the chat box during the whole seminar webinar. And we would like to note that this webinar is recorded just for your information. And if you would like to tweet this event, please feel free to do so using the hashtags that are presented here. But without any further delay, it is my great pleasure to open the webinar. And first, I would like to ask Professor Antti Assikainen, Vice Director of the Natural Resources Institute Finland, Luke, to give his opening speech. Please, Antti.
Thanks, Markus, and dear colleagues and experts of forest inventory. Here in Finland, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of national accomplishment of the National Forest Inventory last year, and we are very proud of this milestone achieved, which has also been the sort of data set or background for all decisions made related with our forests and their utilization and management here in Finland. Personally, I really started to understand the meaning of forest inventories when I was working as a consultant in Eastern Europe, looking at investment possibilities for sawmilling industries, and subsequently when the millennia was turning, there were a lot of research and developments projects in Eastern and Central Europe looking at possibilities of utilizing of forest biomass for energy generation. My background is in wood harvesting and wood sourcing, and practically all of those studies, for instance, in Czech Republic, Poland, Spain, they started with the communication of inventory experts of that country. And then once we had the understanding of the available biomass and also the current utilization from the statistics, we could start the wood availability and supply chain studies that were needed. Later, the LULUCF regulation, which came and its preparation a few years ago, again, the National Forest Inventories were revisited to look at the growth rates, differences between the utilization rates of countries to make a just and fair system. And as Markus stated, today we are again looking at the role of forest inventories in science-based decision-making, also as a source for the level of European level system monitoring system. So with these words, I can assure that we are working with, and you are working with, an extremely important data sets, also from the perspective of the future use, management, protection of the European forest resources. So with these words, I'm sure that you will have extremely interesting seminar. There are very interesting and timely presentations. And with this word, I declare this event opened. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antti. Without further delay, we go to the first presentation. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Petteri Packalen from Luke. His research interests include both practical and theoretical aspects of utilizing remote sensing to monitor and assess the forest environment. And Petteri is having today a speech about different forest inventories support different decisions, the case Finland. Please, Petteri.
Thank you, Markus. Good afternoon, everyone. My talk is about the different role of forest inventories and how these inventories are implemented in Finland. I will also explain what the role of remote sensing in these inventories is. Remote sensing is nowadays increasingly used in this context. Next slide, please. We have two different inventory systems in Finland, National Forest Inventory and Forest Management Inventory, and both are state-funded. National Forest Inventory is implemented by Natural Resources Institute Finland, where I'm working, and it provides regional and national statistics and input data for policy planning. Forest Management Inventory is implemented by another organization, Finnish Forest Center, which also uses companies as subcontractors. And this inventory provides stand-level data for silvicultural decisions. Next slide, please. The first NFI was completed about 100 years ago, as was already mentioned, and already 100 years ago, the concern was the, let's say, unsustainable use of forests. At that time, mainly due to the slash and burn agriculture, firewood cuttings, and increasing industrial use of wood. Today, information needs are broad. For instance, we need annual data for greenhouse gas reporting. We need information about biodiversity, damages, what kind of forest management is practiced, where we have possibility to practice more close to nature management, for instance. We need input data for scenario analysis and so on. Lots of needs today. Next slide, please. National Forest Inventory requires always detailed and quite specific field measurements, not just about trees, but also about the site, soil, and so on. We need to determine forest type, different kind of habitat classifications must be determined. We are interested in the level of naturalness. Tree age is always interesting attribute. Growth is always interesting attribute. What kind of agents are causing damages and at which extent? All of these are, or most of these are such that they need even specific knowledge, in-depth knowledge in the field when these are determined. National Forest Inventory provides unbiased mean and total estimates in large areas, usually in regional or country level, and confidence interval, which is the reliability of these estimates. In Finland, there is also a product called multi-source NFI, which is a forest map based on satellite images. So it's a wall-to-wall map. This has been prepared since 1990s, but it does not contain confidence intervals. In NFI Finland, remote sensing is used to support the inference by post-stratification. So those predictions, the remote sensing based predictions, are not directly used. Next slide, please. This is an example why reliability, those confidence intervals, are important. With the green line, you see how forest growth has evolved in Finland since 1930s. And recently we have observed decline in forest growth. That those vertical bars in the right end of this line depicts 95% confidence intervals, and although they or because they overlap just slightly, we can be pretty sure that this observed decline is real. It's not caused by randomness or so. Next slide, please. Another inventory we have in Finland is this forest management inventory, and in many sense it's more remote sensing based than NFI. In this inventory, airborne LiDAR data and aerial images are used together with field sample plots. And all the data, remote sensing data and field sample plots, are collected in the same year, in the same summer season to be exact, because we are in Finland. This inventory is conducted area by area. You see the map on right. So the cycle is 6 years, and then the size of inventory area is always about 250,000 hectares. So it's this kind of patch that is one inventory area. There are several technical and some other reasons why it cannot be completed in the whole country in the same year. Management inventory provides stand level data of certain stand attributes which are needed in growth models and when we do silvicultural decisions. Next slide, please. Airborne LiDAR data is used in this management inventory because it enables as accurate predictions as possible. Of course, there are some data, remote sensing datasets which provide even more accurate tree attributes, but this is cost-efficient approach as well. But because in Finland we must predict all the attributes by tree species, aerial images are used at the same time to improve the separation of tree species. So all the attributes are predicted for pines, spruces, and deciduous trees as a tree group. A total, I mean, all three species lumped together, such attributes are actually not predicted at all. A part of the process is also redo stand delineation by automated image processing. First, these forest attributes are predicted to those cells, or you may also call them pixels, which you see in the bottom left corner of these slides. The size is 16 times 16 meters. Please go back. And then when they have been predicted to those cells, the average or some other metric, usually the average, is computed to stands from those cells. So finally, what is the output of this stand inventory are those stand attributes that have been predicted by remote sensing. That's very different than in NFI. The next slide, please.
Petri, 1 minute. Thank you.
Yep, this is the last one. To summarize, information contents are very different in the Forest Management Inventory and National Forest Inventory because aims are very different. The scale at which data is used are different. Time series are also indispensable in NFI, not so important in management inventory. Could be, but not so important. Airborne LiDAR data provide very good accuracy for some stand attributes, but by any means it's not the solution for every use case, and it is not feasible at national or even EU level. National Forest Inventory must rely on field measurements, and remote sensing is just used to improve the precision of estimators. That's how it has been organized in Finland. Information needs at the member states and European levels are very similar, and therefore NFI can support those both. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Petri, for this very, very interesting presentation. For the participants, if you have questions to Petri, please address them in the chat and we will deal with your questions in the panel. Thank you. Thank you very much again. Now we will move to Clementine Olds, who is going to tell us something about towards a systematic and continuous monitoring of climate change impacts on forest productivity in Europe. Clementine is a postdoctoral researcher at the French National Institute for Geographic and Forest Information, and her research interests include monitoring of forest growth dynamics and their responses to climate using forest inventory data, tree rings, and statistical modeling. Clementine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Markus, and hello, everyone. So we can go to the next slide. You know that European forests are very diverse in terms of composition, structure, but also growth dynamics, and following objectively their dynamics at different spatial scales is very challenging. Next slide. There is no European forest inventory yet, but next slide. We do have already systematic and exhaustive field inventories that are already performed at the national level. And these national forest inventories are already performed in more than 20 countries in Europe. They have, of course, different origins and histories, different designs and protocol, but harmonization is possible and is already ongoing. Next. And now I'm going to talk about a specific harmonization project that took part between France and Austria regarding forest growth. It's a study project that was basically done in 2017 and 18. that was used to 3 goals: harmonize the French and Austrian NFI, monitor growth dynamics at the regional scale, and most of all, isolate the climate change effects on growth. Next. So we were focusing on 4 common conifer species across the 2 countries and along an oceanic and continental gradient. Next. And again, next. So first of all, harmonizing NFI data is kind of challenging also. I'm not going to talk about this technical part here, but just to illustrate some major differences between the 2 NFIs. In France, we have a systematic annual sampling of the territory. In Austria, this systematic sampling is periodic. And in France, you have 1 year between 2 field campaigns, while in Austria, it's more like 5 to 9 years. Another big difference is like in France, you have temporary plots, and in Austria, you have permanent plots. You can go to the next. And to monitor growth dynamics at the regional scales, we have chosen to focus on ground truth data. And this ground truth is basically radial growth increment. And this increment is measured through coring trees and measuring tree ring width. And again, here there is differences between France and Austria. In France, the sample trees are measured directly in the field for pluriannual and annual radial growth, while in Austria, sample trees are measured for diameter, but there are trees outside the plot that are cored, and these trees are used to interpolate the annual growth of sample trees. Next. This tree data can be scaled up at different spatial scale, of course at the plot level, but here we are really interested at the regional level. Next. So how do we isolate climate change effect on growth while we have these ground truth data? So the statistical modeling is pretty simple. So we are trying to express our raw inventory signal, that is radial growth, as a function of site and stand characteristics. These are used as filters. We want to filter their effect on growth. And basically the model is isolating the residuals, and these residuals are by hypothesis linked to climate effects. So NFI data are used as input in the models, and the output is basically the model residuals. Next. And these residuals can be plotted. Here is an example, and it gives a climate-driven growth chronology. So you have access to actually how growth have evolved during the past decades, and really looking at the climate change effect on growth. And these chronologies can be used to extract growth trend for a given regional forest systems, and then after you can of course compare these trends across systems, but also compare growth trends to climate change. So here here the growth dynamics were studied in pure and even age forest over a 20-year period. And these pure and even age forests were targeted because they are more or less production forests and linked to timber production. And this is what we wanted to look at. And we extracted more than 60,000 radial growth data for the 4 tree species. You have 1 color per tree species, and you can see the location of the ground truth data. And with this data, we were able to follow 20 different regional forest systems. And these are also nicely presented along an elevation gradient. Next. So this is an example of what you get once you apply the model to this different forest system. And here you can see different chronologies for spruce. They are plotted in green, and for Scots pine in red. And you have for low elevation systems on the left and for high elevation on the right. So the first thing is that you can really clearly see that the dynamics are different depending on the tree species and also the elevation region. So the key message is also to see that you can browse the different dynamics in one shot, and this is really helpful when you want to look at how a tree species responds to climate along a bioclimatic gradient. Next. And then after, if you're interested to really look at the climate origin of the differences between trends, you can compare these trends to climate. So here you have two graphs. The y-axis is basically the growth trends over the period, and the x-axis are the trend in a specific temperature parameter. And here we have an expected negative impact of warming in spring and winter on tree growth. That is pretty significant. And we can also see that the continental forest of Austria, that are the squares, are facing a much greater warming than the French system. Next. Something that was a bit less expected is that, again, we found a negative effect of average water resource availability. So here again, you can see the growth trends plotted against average water capacity, which is the average water resources available on sites by the forests. And this effect is negative, which is really counterintuitive in a climate change context. Next. So this basically tells us that forests that are regionally adapted to low water availability have actually a higher resilience to climate change. And this is a major conclusion of the study. Next. So if we talk about conclusions that are a bit broader than the study itself, we can see that harmonization between NFI is possible and of course necessary if you really want to harmonize the data you use and if you want to harmonize the information you produce. Of course, it requires national expertise and time, because you really have to get through all the designs and protocols. But once you've done that, then the results is great because it provides objective and crucial information about forest dynamics in this specific case. Next. The nice things about NFI is that the information gets updated at every new field campaign. So year after year, the chronology we saw can get a year, an additional year, and this is also very nice. Next.
Clementine,
and this information, yeah, 1 minute. Okay, I'm already done. I'm almost done. And this information can also get specialized. This is something that we are doing right now in France. It's a work in progress to really specialize this climate effect on growth using maps. Next. So here, I just wanted to say that this methodology can be spread across Europe because, as I said at the beginning, we have a lot of countries in Europe that do have a National Forest Inventory, and as long as we have ground truth data regarding stand and site characteristics and growth, meaning tree rings, we can actually enlarge the spatial scale of this study. And we have a European network that has already 500,000 field plots waiting for us, and these can be used to survey tree growth and carbon sequestration dynamics at EU level, and of course to implement large-scale climate-smart forest management and adapt carbon sequestration strategy. So next. Next, please. Okay, never mind. So that was my last slide anyway. So thank you all. I think this is your presentation.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, Clementine. And questions to Clementine, please in the chat. Don't be shy. We will deal with them in the panel. So then now we go to the next level. We are going to hear from Issa Alberti, from the Forest Research Center unit at the National Institute of Agriculture and Food Research and Technology in Spain, the potential of NFIs in monitoring forest biodiversity at European level. ICIA has been providing technical and scientific support to the Spanish National Forest Inventory since over 20 years. She is interested in forest monitoring, especially dealing with biodiversity and conservation, and in sustainable forest management, trying to provide a robust information and conclusions about forest systems and their dynamics under the global change frame. Isia, the frame is yours. The floor, not the frame, but the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and hello everyone. It's my pleasure to present you the potential of National Forest Inventories in monitoring forest biodiversity at European level. Next. The objectives of the forest sector have been diversified in the last decade, and the National Forest Inventories are providing information as one of the main sources of information, so they are widening their objectives. Next. There is a need to monitor forest biodiversity and conservation status, as it is mentioned in several strategic documents. And National Forest Inventories are currently the main source of information at a large scale in a long term. And there are some variables of forest types or composition, deadwood that are currently measured. But as Clementine mentioned, National Forest Inventories have sampling designs different, field protocols, and different definitions. And that's why ENFIN started in 2003 the work on harmonization. Just as an example, here you can see the estimates when they are considering the national reference and when they are considering an harmonized reference definition. And the difference in between these two estimates can mean for some countries up to 30%. So they are an important difference for some countries. So to really be able to provide information about what monitoring related with biodiversity are currently measured, we did a survey last year, and as you can see, we received the answers from 25 national forest inventories from Europe in a wide sense, and they represent, as you can see, they are really good represented in the different regions of Europe, and only the Southeast Europe is not very well represented. In the next slides, you will see the variables that are monitoring, those that are partially monitoring, and those that are not monitoring in yellow color. It could happen also that they are irrelevant for some countries. For instance, if a country does not have invasive trees, they are not measuring it, but because it is irrelevant. Regarding the composition, previous one, sorry. As you can see, the 3 species are measured by all countries, and also for the invasive species. But when we go to endangered species, there are more or less 25 countries, 25% of the countries not considering it. Regarding the shrub species, nearly 80% of the countries are taking this information regarding composition, but 30% is not measuring which ones are invasive, and 40% when they are endangered. When we talk about herb species, is the previous one, these figures are lower. Next, please. Thank you. If we consider the structure indicators regarding the structure, all the National Forest Inventory are able to provide this information. And if we go, next please. And if we consider the structure function, I mean indicators that can be considered both, like primary and outgrowth forests, or naturalist, extent age, regeneration, deadwood, or tree mortality. Nearly all or most of the country are able to provide that. In fact, I would like to mention next is that some countries like France are doing especially surveys to be able to detect or to identify old-growth forest in the plots. Next, please. There are also variables that are rarely sampled, like terrestrial mosses or birds information, or some variables that are relatively new and they are taking more and more relevance, like genetic diversity from trees or soil biota. Next. From the 25 countries that from which we received answer, 18 have to report under Habitat Directive about the conservation status assessment. And from these countries, only 40% of them are using the information provided by National Forest Inventories. In fact, we did another survey in 2017 regarding this information and this reporting, and we saw that the countries were having different approaches with different indicators. So we proposed a list of indicators that can be harmonized through Europe, and we analyzed the need to establish the reference values from that in an harmonized way. So, as a discussion and conclusions, National Forest Inventories really monitor a wide number of variables related with biodiversity. In fact, there are a increasing number of variables, and not all of them are easily correlated with remote sensing. In fact, as you have seen, the ones that are monitored, some of them, like invasive species, regeneration, or tree genetics diversity, cannot be taken in. I mean, they really need field measurements. But however, more efforts are needed to integrate National Forest Inventory data with other sources of information. For instance, to obtain connectivity, fragmentation indicators, or not monitored data. And National Forest Inventory could, for sure, contribute better towards a more objective and harmonized long-term assessment for the conservation assessment status and in a wider number of countries. Next. And there has been a lot of efforts done regarding harmonizations. In ENFIN, it has been a lot of work on reference definitions. For instance, there is a reference definitions for National Forest Inventory regarding deadwood and also for forest age. There has been also efforts to select indicators that can be harmonized, like from stand structure or ground vegetation. And regarding these indicators that we have seen, there have been harmonized estimation also, but only in a few, in a low number of countries. So there is a need to continue with the harmonization process. We could work on the reference definitions for National Forest Inventories on old growth forests and regeneration, to work on the selection of indicators, for instance, the Israeli or new sample variables, and of course to work on harmonized estimation that this time has European scale. So there is a need to continue with this harmonization process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isia, and being in time. That was very interesting, and I read with great pleasure the potential in biodiversity assessment attributes of NFIs. That's a nice study that you undertook. Thank you. And I'm sure that your presentation will raise a lot of questions. Please address them in the chat and we will deal with them in the panel discussion. Our next speaker is Professor Johannes Breidenbach from NIBIO in Norway. And I just learned last week that Johannes is going to be a coordinator of a EU project, which he's now going to talk about a project called Pathfinder. which is towards an integrated, consistent European LULUCF monitoring and policy pathways assessment framework. Johannes is a professor at NIBO, and he leads the team developing the Norwegian Forest Resources Map SR16. His main interest is in the field of biometry and statistical methods to combine field and remotely sensed data with the aim to improve small and large area estimates. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and thanks for reading the long title already. Then I get away from that. Yes, and indeed, this is a very fresh project. It's so fresh that it's not even finally accepted, so please keep that in mind. But most likely we will, in the end, sign a grant agreement and have the project done. So therefore, we thought it's already now very important to share some information about the project with you all, because many of you will be our cooperation partners and stakeholders. So this project is a cooperation of many ENFIN partners. Please go back one slide. Of many ENFIN partners, and please go back. Okay. And ICP forests and ICP forest partners, and is will most likely be funded by Horizon Europe. So this, yeah, and there are of course many other partners besides these two big groups of partners. So please, next slide. And as I said, we are invited to the grant agreement preparation. That means we don't have anything signed yet, so please take this as a disclaimer. Next, please. The anticipated start will be September 2022, so this year. Duration will be 4 years. And the budget will be 6.3 million euros and is covered by 22 partners and 17 subcontractors throughout all Europe. It's one of 3 projects that will be funded in this call that is on the contribution of forest management to climate action. Next, please. So the 2 main things we will be working on are basically creating a forest monitoring framework. You can see that on the left-hand side of this slide. Basically, by combining the European National Forest Inventories and ICP forest field plots, and all that we will combine with remotely sensed data. And so we will do this to create maps and estimates. In addition, we will also measure a rather small number of consistent field plots across Europe to improve the harmonization process across the NFIs and to find synergies with in areas where we are maybe missing field information. Next, please. And in this, this information, these maps, will then be used to create future forest scenarios. And these scenarios will be analyzed in the context of policy frameworks and laws that will maybe in a contradictory way influence how we treat our forests, how forest management is performed. And this causes, or this, in the context of policy, this is called a policy pathway assessment. So please back one slide. Yeah, back one slide, please. Yes. So we are still at the pathway assessment. So this here the question is, how will different decisions of policy decisions affect the different forest structures, and how will forestry the forestry sector interact with the other sectors around it. Next slide, please. The project is structured in 6 work packages, and you see them here. So in one work package 1, we will analyze advanced field measurements, designs and measurement devices. So a range, now the presentation disappeared for me. I hope you can still see it. But yeah, it comes back. Yeah, anyways, in this work package, we will look at the field measurements and the European Forest Inventory design. In another work package, we will analyze the, yeah, here we go. We will create a mapping and estimation platform that basically combines all the information. In work package 3, we will look at the simulations and scenarios. And that means for forecasting the forest structures. And this will then go into these policy analysis, where we will identify possible pathways. And a very important part of the work package 4 is also to develop a root system, let's say. That means a governance structure for this forest inventory and monitoring system that ensures that this system will go on after the project is finalized. And of course, there's communication with many stakeholders, and here are just a few of them on the European level that are shown with these logos here. So next slide, please. Well, the main impacts of the research, so once the research results are taken into action after the project, is then basically we will have an integrated forest monitoring system integrated with a pathway assessment system across Europe, and a consistent reporting system for Europe's LULUCF sector. The pathways that I described, we will have that will describe how different forest management strategies contribute towards climate, biodiversity, and economic targets, and not the least also the process of generating these pathways that probably always will need to be renewed over time. Next slide, please. We have 22 partners in this project, and that's all. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes, and I'm sure you will have interesting years ahead. And looking at your main impacts, at least many forest policymakers or decision makers are really enlightened about your impacts that you are having described here. Thank you. And I can see that there are already some questions to Johannes, which we will deal in the panel with. And good luck for the project.
Thank you very much.
So after the national viewpoints, the viewpoints on harmonization of data and on what the National Forest Inventories could provide in the case of forest biodiversity attributes, it is now my great pleasure to welcome the head of the Department for Forest Inventory at the Austrian Research Center for Forest, the BFW, the deputy head of the BFW and the chair of the European National Forest Inventory Network, ENFIN, Dr. Clemens Schadauer. Clemens focuses in his research on large-scale forest inventories and monitoring, combined use of statistical-based field samples and remote sensing techniques, status and development of national forest inventories, and at harmonization techniques, a long list. And Clemens is talking today about the ENFIN approach to a European forest monitoring. Clemens, please go ahead.
Thank you, Markus. A very warm welcome also from my side. I'm sitting here in Vienna and the sun is shining, so I hope you have also these nice weather conditions. It was quite a interesting but very, very dense information which we received so far. So I'll try to wrap up a little bit, looking a little bit more from the statistical point of view. Nevertheless, I have to include some technical aspects. So next slide, please. ENFIN wrote a so-called discussion paper, how ENFIN envisions a European system for monitoring forests. You can actually download and read it on our ENFIN homepage, and it's now my pleasure to show you some details of this discussion paper. Please, next slide. So, starting a little bit with the background, we have heard all of this in the presentations. National Forest Inventories fulfill national information needs since a very, very long time. They have been established in nearly all European countries, and ENFIN is working now for near to 20 years on harmonization activities. Actually, we met at JRC in 2002, so it's 20 years ago now. We met at JRC at the LULUCF issues. For LULUCF issues, I met my colleagues from Finland and from Sweden, and we said we have to do something, and this was the point at JRC where we founded actually ENFIN. Next slide, please. We have already heard forest monitoring rests upon two main technical pillars, the field-based sample plots and remote sensing. And the remote sensing part is very, very well known in NFIs because sometimes we are only seen as running through the forest and grabbing data. Somehow that's simply not true. We learned from Finland, they are working with remote sensing technologies for more than 30 years already. So what we learned within the NFI is to make the best use, how to combine these two worlds. And I'll try to show you some aspects of this way of combination. Maybe next slide, please. So during I'm talking, maybe you can see that there is a calendar running on this forest map of Austria. What I want to explain here is that this is a product of our NFI, and it simply shows the phenology of Austrian forests. Now it's getting green, you see, it's summertime, and now it's getting autumn, so it's the color changes actually, the leaves fall down, and then we are in October and November. So why we are producing such a system? Because we are not so much interested in all the details of phenology, that's not our job, but what it is, what our job is to look at the deviations from this normal situation of phenology. And if we interpret these deviations, we very, very often find that it's caused by forest management, or it's caused by storms, or bark beetle attacks, and so on. And so, next slide, please. We can create maps of this influence on the phenology, like you see here on the right-hand side. This is a map showing in 3 different colors, meaning 3 different years of bark beetle attacks in Austria. And if we would combine these areas with volume, we even could try to get an idea how much volume actually was affected here by bark beetles. I wrote on the left-hand side that this is a combined use at the information level, because up to now my story did not include NFI sample plots. But of course, we have to think that we have to combine this kind of information with the typical harvest statistics coming from NFIs. And we can do this, so this is a combined use at the information level. But you can also combine remote sensing technologies and field-based sample plots at the plot level. Next slide, please. So what you see here is what we call a point cloud, a 3D point cloud. This is also, we have heard a little bit about this in the Finnish presentation. This is a typically 3D point cloud in Austria. And what is interesting here is that you can make direct measurements in these point clouds. You can, for example, derive the height of the vegetation. And this is, of course, very interesting if you have the height of the vegetation, and if you combine this height of the vegetation with field plot information from NFIs, you can, for example, derive the standing volume per hectare. And maybe we can show you the next slide, please. Here you have a map. So the resolution, of course, of this map is extremely high. It's one square meter. So this is not for the European issue, but of course it can be used for European approaches. For example, because you can use it somehow to validate European projects. Of course, you have to be very, very cautious because it's also a model which is used here. But I'm very sure it could be interesting for European approaches as well. And then the third way of putting together the two data is the statistical level. Next slide, please. And this is what we have already heard. It's for minimizing the statistical errors. So we learned from Sweden that, for example, post-stratification is one way of working with this kind of statistical level combination of remote sensing technologies and field-based sampling. So next slide, please. Yes. So how to use this national expertise for European forest monitoring? There are several approaches. Next slide. You can use it directly. So include NFI's expertise to expand methods from the national to the European level. And of course, we should continue our work on harmonization. Please. And you can also indirect use our expertise, which means that you include us for the validation of European level products. I think both approaches make a lot of sense. You can also just marginal use our expertise and just ask for data. But from my point of view, of course, you know, this is not taking into account that I didn't count all the people who are working within the frame or very close to NFIs, working for all these issues which we discussed up to now. So it's 100, 200, 300 researchers working on this. So I would really recommend to use this expertise and not just ask for our data. Next slide, please. What is very, very important if we are talking about remote sensing, which is very important at the moment, but there are so many other ways, other parameters needed for a European report which you cannot assess with remote sensing. Here you see an example. I do not see up to now an approach with remote sensing on the large scale which can do these measurements you can see here. Next slide, please. So we also thought a little bit of institutionalizing this European forest monitoring, and we came up with some basic requirements. Of course, we need a legal basis for this, and we would need continuous EU funding, because we are here not talking about one project. We are talking about continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring asks, of course, for continuous funding. Saying this, we also decided that it would be a good idea to institutionalize the ENFIN network a little bit more, like it is now, with a so-called ENFIN office. And the main role of this office would be to coordinate the NFI institutions. So we would involve all the NFIs from data collection up to reporting. we would use the existing quality control systems and expand them to the European level. You have seen that we are always talking about uncertainty. Very often, this is not so highlighted at the political level, but we know it's very, very important. And of course, we will set a link to ICP forests. And then we want to develop a governance structure. We have heard this from the Johannes Breidenbach already, together with European Commission, with CRC, AEA, and many others. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. As I already mentioned, here you have the link to our ENFIN homepage where you can download much more details of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clemens. That was very, very interesting. And in the last slide, concrete examples for cooperation or ideas for cooperation. Thank you. I'm sure it will raise questions for the discussion. Because the idea of this webinar was to contribute or to continue the discussion on the European level forest monitoring, it was very good to invite, and also thank you for accepting the European Commission bodies on their viewpoint on what are the forest-related information needs in Europe at the moment. And it is my great pleasure to welcome two presentations. First, we have the presentation of Raphael Lelovier from the DG ENVI. He is a forest policy officer at the European Commission. He's working on the implementation of the EU Forest Strategy 2030, particularly on the protection of primary and old growth forest and the legislative proposal for forest monitoring. Raphael, welcome. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Hello, everyone. Just to answer to Clemens, I'm in Brussels, and surprisingly, it's a very rainy day, but we're used to this here. So I just want to start off saying that I'm very happy to be here and to participate in this webinar. So because all presentations have been very interesting already, and also some very concrete proposals also from ENFIN on cooperation. And as you'll see, work on the accessibility of European data and forests is a very big topic at the moment, and will be very valuable to address some of the most pressing issues which are forests facing today, but also or even especially in the future. So I'll give you a more political view on forest monitoring in Europe and what the Commission wants a future harmonized framework to deliver. So I think that most of you actually know the new EU forest strategy quite well, but we have many participants here, and I'll give a very brief introduction to the strategy and then dive into the needs for forest data. So next slide, please. Yes, so first as an introduction, I'll mention two other EU initiatives relevant today. So these are the European Green Deal, which was communicated in December 2019, and the Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. The European Green Deal is a very broad set of policy initiatives by the Commission with the overarching aim of making the European Union climate neutral by 2050. And a notable feature is that all EU actions and policies now have to contribute to the European Green Deal objectives, one of them being preserving and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity. And the European Green Deal also sets the stage for other relevant initiatives. It calls for the EU Biodiversity Strategy and for a new EU Forest Strategy. Next slide, please. And so the new EU Forest Strategy was published in July of last year. The strategy will contribute to achieving the EU's biodiversity objectives, as well as greenhouse gas emission reduction targets of at least 55% by 2030 and of being climate neutral by 2050. And going through some of the strategy's main objectives, it aims to improve the quantity and quality of EU forests, to strengthen the protection, restoration, and resilience, adapt Europe's forests to climate change, ensure that forests continue to deliver their socioeconomic functions, and ensure vibrant rural areas with thriving populations. And notably, the strategy also recognizes the central and multifunctional role of forests, and aims to promote the many services that forests provide. And there, I suppose it already becomes clear that to achieve many of these objectives, data on forests in the EU are, of course, a precondition. Next slide, please. Yes, so what does the EU forest strategy actually say on forest monitoring? So the idea is to develop an EU-wide forest observation framework to provide open access to detailed, accurate, regular, timely and harmonized information on the condition and management of EU forests and the many products and ecosystem services which they deliver. So some objectives are to allow better informed decision making on forests, and this at each level. So it could be for administration, but also for forest owners and managers. But it will also allow us to, for example, fight illegal logging and incentivize and reward more sustainable forest management, but of course support the adaptation of our forests to climate change. Next slide, please. So to take a step back, I want to mention that forest information has never been as important as it is today, and we have a lot of EU priority initiatives which really heavily rely on high quality data and above all harmonized data so that we can make statements at the EU level and to reach various objectives, including the ones of the European Green Deal. Next slide, please. So that we have today, so at European scale, as you know, we currently have no monitoring requirements for member states since the Forest Focus regulation expired in 2007. So we currently have, in a way, relatively patchy network with, and of course this depends on the member states, data which, at least compared to what is possible with today's technology, is sometimes lower resolution, be it spatial or temporal, or very different resolutions and timeframes depending on the member states. And this, perhaps most importantly, is that there's a strong lack of interoperability between data sets. So we're missing common definitions, the differences in reporting methods and in interpretation, which of course add to the difficulty of establishing more homogeneous and broadly agreed upon data sets at European level. And this is what was mentioned today with harmonization. And on top of that, large differences in, for example, the reporting frequency of member states. And finally, there's no easy public access to data. Systems vary, and some might actually not be accessible at all. Next slide, please. So this is why the Commission plans this legislative proposal for a forest observation, reporting and data collection framework. Its current adoption aims for the second quarter of 2023, but this initiative is still in very early works, and a lot still needs to be decided on as discussions are still ongoing within the Commission itself. But this is also why it's very valuable to be here and listen to you and have this discussion. What we do know, however, is what we want to achieve. So we have this this high-level political request for a harmonized framework, but more importantly, almost we have this in a way non-negotiable requirement to for the state to face the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and to understand the forests, to preserve them for future generations. And then, of course, well, the question that we now have to ask ourselves is, which happens to be what today's webinar is all about, how do we get there? But that said, what we look for in the forest monitoring framework is the following. So as stressed already, we need to collect harmonized data, and this means standardized definitions, methods, and preparation, ideally from the ground up. This is also an aspect where remote sensing will prove to be invaluable, also for timely data. And we also need this data to be as detailed as possible, of course, depending on the available technologies, depending on the indicators that we're looking at. But we really have to strive for the highest spatial and temporal resolution. This framework should focus on EU policy relevant topics, but what we're looking at goes far beyond conventional data on trees. So it's data on the forest state, but the trends they use and pressure they face and other interlinked indicators. So which could be, of course, forest biodiversity, information on tree health, such as defoliation, but also tree structure, the canopy levels, undergrowth. then climate-related pressures, but also the provision of ecosystem services and socioeconomic uses of forests. And these indicators should be defined together with member states, experts, researchers, and all relevant stakeholders. And I think a lot of people present here will hopefully be involved in this. And this framework will also focus on remote sensing or geospatial data, taking advantage especially of the Copernicus and Galileo services. But it will of course need to be calibrated, but also completed and improved with ground data, as of course not everything can be monitored using remote sensing. Next slide, please. And then another very important aspect of the framework will be the accessibility of this data, which should be delivered through FISA. So FISA is the Forest Information System for Europe, which should be enhanced to become what we call the cornerstone for harmonized forest data in Europe. So again, in other words, a sort of one-stop shop for data in European forests. And there we also want to go further than just providing data. It will include dashboard with updated key indicators on European forests, but also GP analysis, interpretation with regularly published reports and lay summaries, and of course a strong emphasis on open data, so meaning is accessible to each and everyone for free, which we already have many working examples for globally. Now, my colleague Alessandro from the JSC will give you more information on the importance of this initiative and how it can be shaped with available technologies. So, yeah, thanks for taking me over, Alessandro.
Thank you very much, Raphael, for this very comprehensive introduction on the legislative proposal in the EU forest strategy, and also on the information needs that you may have in the future. Thank you very much. That was very informative. And I see that in the chat there are questions raising up. Very good. Please keep on writing your questions. And I see also that
please do.
Yeah, and some of our presenters are already replying. That's very good. So then the next speaker of the European Commission body is from the GRC, is Mr. Alessandro Carti. He's a senior researcher at the Directorate for Sustainable Resources of the Joint Research Center and of the European Commission. Alessandro has expertise on forest ecology and remote sensing. His research focuses on the interplay between forests and climate, with the objectives to assess forest-based mitigation and adaptation options, as well as climate impacts on forest. Alessandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me at this meeting, which I think is extremely important and exactly in the direction we at JRC hope the discussion about monitoring will evolve. So I start sharing my presentation here. Hope it works. Let me know if you see it.
We can see it. Thank you.
Good. So Raphael introduced and sketched very well the policy frame, so I can go fast on it. But clearly, the message I take, the most important from the previous speaker, what Raphael said, is that forest information has never been as important as they are now in the European scene. And this is because the European Green Deal, the climate change happening, the whole issue about protecting and restoring the forest, biodiversity conservation, and so on and so forth. So we are in an exceptional moment. And I think this is the right mindset where everyone should be at the moment when we discuss about new monitoring system, because this is what the new forest strategy is requiring, to develop based on Copernicus, remote sensing, and ground-based monitoring. It's already designed from the beginning that we need this integration, a monitor of climate effects and natural induced disturbances on forests. What is really making these specific moments exceptional is that forest data are required, but an enormous number of policy initiatives, strategies, and laws and so on that are of interest for the entire European community Here I listed the one that came to my mind, but I'm sure there are more. We go, of course, from high-level initiatives like the Green Deal, but then down to specific laws like the climate law or specific regulation about, for instance, how we consider the LULUCF sector in the climate mitigation strategies. But also, we of course go to from a forest strategy to the biodiversity strategy, up to regulation that refers to timber use and deforestation-free products, and so on and so forth. And this give us the flavor of why we need some sort of open mindset for addressing this enormous request for having accurate and available information for Europe. When we think about the design of a multi-purpose monitoring system for EU forest, I got a series of objectives in my head. For what are the requirements? Certainly, it has to be timely. And it has to be timely because we are in a time of change. Things are changing very quickly. We see what is happening at the moment, for instance, in Central Europe with the bark beetles. In a few years, we have countries like the Czech Republic, whose entire forest sector has been completely devastated by an insect. Because climate is changing very quickly, and we have seen it. This signal is already evident also in forest inventory. And because the policy, the climate policy and the natural, the policies about our protection to nature is changing. So information has to be timely, and they have to be spatially explicit, because policy is spatially explicit, management is spatially explicit. We have to go to a level of details in space that we haven't achieved before. But because this flow of information has to feed the policy process, it also has to be transparent, so that everyone, stakeholders, users, policymaker, or even citizen should have a possibility to see where the data are coming from and what they include. It has to be comprehensive, but also robust, consistent, and standardized. So there are many requirements that we have. And when I think about the technology we have, of course, remote sensing, we have heard about it a lot of times. Aerial surveys, also mentioned many times. Plot data, and where most people here is super expert in, but also ecosystem modeling. And we have several tools on our desk. And so I tried myself to map these requirements to those methods. And immediately I saw that fundamentally each of the specific requirements match to a specific methodology, but I don't have no one single methodology that fulfills all the list of requirements. And this, I think, should make us understand that no one in isolation can reach the level of details that we need and the requirement we have. There's only one answer.
Sorry, Alessandro.
Yes.
Terribly sorry to interrupt you. It's not a nice way, but some of you can see your presentation and some cannot see your presentation. So from the organizer side, Wilhelmina or Ellen, what can we do about it?
I think Wilhelmina has a backup copy of my presentation that she can share.
Yes, we think that it's because of some organization accounts don't allow this presentation to be seen, because some participants can see this normally like us, but we can put the PDF you send us as backup to
yes, please.
Here,
yes,
so
please.
we can just a minute.
Do so. Please do so. I apologize for that. Teams sometime.
No, sorry for interrupting that, but please keep your thought.
Okay, let's wait. Yeah. So what I was saying is that therefore we have this list of requirements, this list of methodology, and we have this, let's say, the need of really go to an integration of all these various methods if we want to respond and to all the requirements at once. And I'm very pleased also from the presentation that Clemens gave before, but also by the NFI, to see that this is actually happening in the NFI world. I'm aware of that, even though different countries with different speed into that. Now we need to bring this spirit of integration across disciplines, really involving and spreading, to this network to people that are coming from the remote sensing perspective, or from the ecosystem modeling perspective, because for some of the variables, thinking for instance soil carbon or so, it's for me it's clear that we have also to integrate some level of modeling. Will be difficult to do it just with measurements. Yeah, okay, we can go to the next. I think you can zoom out, yeah, a bit so we can see it. Good, excellent. So the key problem in a way is how to make this huge jump from a satellite constellation we have around the Earth and a man with a caliber in the field. We know we need these two elements. They are both equally valuable, and that's the only way to have a robust estimate, which is also spatially explicit and timely. And for that, I really like that this community is now organizing these events and organizing projects like the one that was presented by Johannes, and more get involved in a larger, let's say, network of people with various expertise to give the answer that we need. Next, please. Speaking about parameters, this is, we know we have a long list now, which is emerging. That's the problem when you think about a multi-purpose monitoring system. It will serve several policies, and this is clearly leading to a longer list of parameters. It will not just be about biomass and food and carbon pool, but we will have to have status, health, composition, biodiversity, bedwood, soil properties, with an integration of scales from the plot to the airborne to the satellite. The recommendation that we can do from our scientific point of view in JLC is that this parameter list is key. It has to be discussed and agreed among a large user community and stakeholders community, but it has to be done so with a forward-looking spirit, because there are so many challenges for our forests ahead of us that are led by the combined impact of climate change on one side and the changes in the requirements from the society that requires this kind of open mind. And of course, when we think about parameters, methods, how we design it, I think we have to make all an effort to find the best compromise so that these parameters from the beginning are the right one to allow this full integration between scales and between methods, between plot, aerial, and satellite data streams. I know there are steps in this direction. I think also that we are not yet there, that there's potentially a lot of room ahead of us to achieve a full standardization from the beginning, because if you start thinking in a standardized way, then also the need of harmonization is actually mostly solved. Next, please. We know the satellite constellation is expanding every month. Even Copernicus with Sentinel-1 and 2 now is producing incredibly high resolution in time and space. We will have new sensors in like P-band radar. We have lasers now up on the space station that can deliver quite a bit of data. Next, please. For sure, these are incredibly valuable data if you think about the optical sensors to make the kind of analysis that Clement was showing at continental scale or even at global scale, having a temporal dynamic of NDVI, for instance, from where we can derive phenology, as Clement was showing, at high resolution, but at the same time in a standardized way, let's say, across continents. Next, please. In addition to having new technology like JEDI, this laser, which is currently on the space station that delivers us information on tree height, we have been hearing about airborne LiDAR in previous presentation, but we know of the technical limitation of it. We cannot fly the entire of Europe every year with airborne LiDAR, but we have a LiDAR on the space station at the moment, and in 2 years collected something like 25 million upsampling points across the EU. This is a database we're working on, and the color you see there is tree height, and from where we can also have estimates of tree biomass. So this is the technology advancing. Is it enough? It clearly is not. Next, please. This increased availability.
1 minute, please. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. This increased availability in Earth observation is in reality increasing the demand for robust surface data. The satellites are not saying that the not generating, let's say, an underuse of plot data. It's the contrary. Your data have never been so useful, have never been so crucial. Even it's plot data, aerial data. It's the great opportunity now, I think, for your community to arrive at even higher level of visibility and importance in the global monitoring. Next, please. A few words about the role of JRC into the process. We will, following the request of the Commission, build an European observatory on deforestation, forest degradation, changes in world forest cover and associated drivers. And according to the request of the forest strategy, we'll also help in building a forest science partnership where some of the scientific issue and discussed in the European Academy will be transferred also into recommendation for the monitoring system. Next, please. This observatory will have 4 legs, going from pan-European monitoring of pressures, assessing forest resources for the EU, but also going global to tropical monitoring and trade flows. Next. But overall, the role that JRC will play is to be there as a bridge between the academic, the policy DGs in Brussels, the stakeholders, and to try to speak the language of all of you and help the networking, because this is what we are actually needing at the moment. We need to link communities and reach that level of integration that is required to fulfill all the requirements of the new European monitoring system. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. It was very interesting to see also what the Commission has planned with the observatory. And this webinar is, in my understanding, one first step of communicating between the data providers and the data requirers. Now we will switch or go to the panel discussion, and I would like to invite all the presenters to the panel discussion. I will also now be joined by 2 of my colleagues from the BFW, Alexandra Freudenschuss and Thomas Schwantner, who will help me with the chat questions to be addressed to the different panelists. And I will start right away with some questions that I have on my list to the different presenters, and then Alexandra and Thomas can continue with the questions in the chat. So first I will ask questions to presenters from my side. First question would be to Petri. I was wondering that can remote sensing provide all the information that is needed from the national policy side? Petri, would you have an answer on that?
Of course not. Like previous talks emphasized, there are actually quite many attributes which are not in good correlation with remote sensing metrics, with any remote sensing metrics. But remote sensing is useful in some cases, especially if you are interested in growing stock attributes. It can be used to improve the precision of estimators.
Thank you. Thank you. Then I would have a question to Clementine, and you have been presenting the harmonization of two NFI data sets in France and Austria, and the possibilities to extend this to more European level. And to which extent do you think this is feasible, and how much time would this require, this harmonization?
Thank you, Marcus, for a very good question. Indeed, the harmonizing data across countries first need that these countries monitor these variables. And in the case of growth dynamics, my study is based on tree ring data. So it means that in a way or another, NFI would core trees within the plot or outside, depending. I mean, I presented also the French and the Austrian NFI have different vision on coring trees and methodologies, but as long as tree rings are available, then I think the methodology could be applied quite easily. And then the time it would require to harmonize more than 2 NFIs, well, I think 2 NFIs, it took approximately 1.5 years to harmonize and to produce data. and objective information. So I would say that if you extend it to Europe and if you plan regular meeting of national experts, that may be within a 10-year framework, then something should be really robust. So I think by Horizon 2030, we would already have something really nice.
Thank you. Thank you for the estimation. Next question would go to ECR, and well, that was very interesting. The overview of many countries, the information that you obtained, and I was thinking that would it be possible to have the biodiversity assessment based on the attributes you were presenting if they are founded? So I understand that it's also a question of money, yeah, to have many of these attributes getting the data obtained.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, of course. As you can see, well, if you have in my presentation, it was there was a list of variables that were rarely measured, let's say, and with these variables, you can see the great potential of National Forest Inventory to take and to provide a more complex assessment on different taxa, on different attributes, on soil biota. You have seen also the tree genetics, but of course there is a limited budget, and the European National Forest Inventories have different grids, but it goes from 0.5 to plus 1 kilometers to 5 kilometers. So there's a huge number of plots, and it is crucial to optimize to the time that you are in the field and to have really robust and reliable information. But so there is limited budget, but with more budget, of course, many more measurements can be done.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question to Clemens. There's a lot of discussion why NFI are so guarded sometimes when it comes to the sharing of plot coordinates. I guess. So what is your viewpoint on that? Sorry for the straight questions, but I've been participating in some of the discussions where the plot coordinates were an issue that was discussed.
Yes, thank you for your question, Marcus. Of course, we are discussing this issue within the ENFIN initiative also since 20 years. So why are we so cautious? It's, I think I have to explain it here. So, you know, NFI plot sampling systems are based on strict statistical principle. And the most important one is what we call representativity. And representativity means that we can conclude from our plot data. So I give an example of Austria. Our sampling density is 0.008% of total forest area. 0.0808%, yeah. So given this sampling density, you can imagine that we are quite sensible for influences on our representativity. And but the kind of upscaling based on this representativity is the backbone of our statistics. So given this very low sampling density, maybe you find it very low, but you can estimate forest area with plus minus 1% for all of Austria. So it's enough for sure. But this means that when we destroy this representativity, you destroy the whole NFI system. And I'm sure that something, this is something that nobody wants. So if we just open our data, including the coordinates, it will be rather quickly happen that at least some of forest owners or manager will get to know the coordinates and the exact plot coordinates, which are located in their forest. They are owning this forest. And this means that they will for sure adapt the way of management. That's 100%. They will adapt their management. So, and this would then, as explained before, heavily affect the representativity of our data, and this would mean that it would corrupt the whole system. But I think we could prove in the past that it is possible to cooperate with institutions outside the NFIs, and we can use the coordinate nevertheless, because they do not necessarily have to leave the countries. That's not necessary that they can be used. There are very different ways of working with this, but it's proven that it works. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the discussions will continue on that. Thank you, Clemens. And then last but not least, I would have a question both to Raffaele and Alessandro. You may answer them separately, but I would be interested on what is, in your opinion, the key priorities in the development of the new EU forest monitoring system. So what would be the next step? Raffaele, you have been already presenting some timetable, but some concrete steps perhaps.
Thanks. Yes, this is where I can't tell you as much as I would like to, since, as I said, a lot is still being discussed internally. Now we need to agree with different DGs on the direction we want to take. If you want also a directive or regulation, a lot of things are still very open. But I can really show you that a lot should be clear soon, since if you want to keep up with the timeline, we will have to advance very fast. But this is not something where I might have to disappoint slightly in the information that we have available.
Okay, and it's an ambitious plan. Huh? Oh, very good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very good. And then from Alessandro's point of view, from the technical, what would you think that are the key priorities in developing the European observatory?
Yeah, I think it's the key point from my point of view is approach the problem with an open mindset. And as I said it before in the presentation, we have in a moment when things are changing and have to change, and for that reason I think we have to play from the beginning with a large number of let's say research institution, academic institution, and expertise field to build this system, because it has to be a multi-purpose forest monitoring system, which has to address questions from both the food supply chain, if you want, but also to biodiversity, health, vulnerability, resilience, questions that we haven't really, they were not so high in the agenda, let's say, in the past. And it has to be European, which we have to have it everywhere with the same system, the same methodology from Portugal to Finland, wall to wall. Because many of the questions that we have ahead of us requires an answer at continental scale. These are, from my point of view, priorities. Of course, it's a time of change. Any change is bringing risk and opportunities. My call is for everyone to look at the opportunities, which I think are way, way more than the risks.
Positive thinking is there.
Yes.
The key. Thank you, Alessandro. Alexandra and Thomas, do we have questions to address to the panelists picked up from the chat? Alexandra, would you like to start?
Hello, Marcus. Hello, everybody. Yes, there were quite a lovely discussions on the chat, so thanks for that. And we have one question at the beginning for Petteri Pakkanen concerning the usefulness and the possibility to use LiDAR data at national level. This was already answered, but I think it's important also to address it now to the whole public, to the whole authority. And perhaps you can also, Petter, you can also address the question on how or which data can be collected within 1 year. So do we adjust the data acquisition for these specifications, and can we facilitate annual collection at national or EU level? Petteri, please.
Thank you. Could you be a little bit more specific? What would you like to hear about national LiDAR data? Difficulties in acquisition or solutions, or what do you mean?
The question was raised concerning how they can be used for specific purposes, and if the application at national level is a problem or not. So. Okay.
Yeah. So I had actually 2 points. The first one is that LiDAR data is useful in the prediction of certain attributes, certain key attributes, such as volume, biomass, and so on, tree height, and so on. But always when we use airborne data, by airborne data I mean that we collect data by aircraft in practice. So we are limited to areas that are not huge. So if we, for instance, in Finland, we do, the cycle is 6 years when the entire country is covered. And even this campaign requires that quite large portion of the capacity that is available in private market is allocated to Finland annually. So if we want to collect airborne data from very large areas, we must be sure that the capacity is available. And it does not happen if private sector can rely on that we will collect it annually, since it requires huge investments. So in theory it's possible, but it would be very expensive solution. I hope this clarified things.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thomas, would you have the next question?
Yes. There were questions about the presentation given by Clementine, and one was regarding the multi-annual resolution of measurements, the periodic measurements versus annual measurements. But I think Clementine has already answered this quite well. It's necessary to have annual year rings. And the second one was about the role of the tree age in these models, how they are covered in the models that predict the growth trends.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, for this question. Actually, the age of the forests are not taken into account directly in the models. We are taking the size, tree size and tree height. So because age estimates are less reliable than size estimates, we know that growth is influenced by age and size, but size are much more reliable variables when it comes to field measurements. And as far as we targeted a homogeneous forest, then their age can be approximated by size, because they're managed in such a way that, you know, it's pure and regular forest. So normally when you have the fertility also, it's taken into account into the model. So you have size, soil factors, etc. So age is not it's not needed anymore. So it's not in the model, but other variables are taken into account.
Yeah, thank you. So I understood it in this way. Thank you for this clear answer.
Thank you. Then I would have a question to Raphael. Is it expected to integrate the EU forest monitoring obligations with the already implemented FRA reporting, the forest resources reporting? And how will it be linked between the EU forest monitoring under the EU forest strategy with the monitoring of the upcoming restoration law? It was asked by Anna Isabel.
Yes, thanks. I actually answered this in the chat, but it's good that you mention it. And so of course we want to have the monitoring framework support the reporting to the FAA and the upcoming nature restoration law, which will also include targets where monitoring will be needed, and we of course want to avoid as much as possible additional reporting burden on that side, and this is actually also a way for being more cost efficient by using remote sensing and harmonization for the reporting that member states are already having to do.
Thank you. Alexandra, would you have the next question?
Yes, for sure. So my next question goes to Isir. Isir, could you provide a bit more insights why harmonization at the process is so important at regional level? So based on experiences, harmonization efforts in Europe versus the Latin American region, and what can those parts learn from each other?
Yes, thank you. That question was asked by Rocío Condor because we are also collaborating with them. In ENFIN is collaborated with the network from Latin America and Caribbean countries. And yes, there are what I think is that there are different information requirements, and that's why we started harmonizing the European forest inventory data, and also it is important to highlight that due to the different conditions, the science between the two continents are they differ, but of course many approaches can be done. The optimal is that they are as close as possible and with reference definitions as similar as possible. So it is great if we are working to a global harmonized assessment at the end. I don't know if I answered your question. Or...
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks. Thomas, next question.
Yes, there was a question in the chat room for Johannes, which is a question that turns up quite often, and it is about the resolution, the spatial resolution on which he will be aiming on this Pathfinder project.
Yeah, we're aiming for very high resolution, but the resolution may depend on the variable. So that needs to be seen, given which variables, what resolution is possible. But in general, it's, if I say high resolution, it's between 10 and 20 meters of what the resolution of sentinels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I would have a question that I would like to, it's to all speakers, but I would like to address it to Clemens. One of the newest policy proposals suggesting using remote sensing for deforestation and forest degradation assessments. Could you kindly clarify what could be the pros and cons of such an approach in this particular example?
Well, if we are talking about deforestation, firstly, we have to find a common map of forests in Europe. We know that there have been several approaches since a long time already that we developed forest maps during the last 20 years on the European scale. But for the question of deforestation, you know, that's a little bit tricky because they have to be highly accurate. Because in European forests, it's not the same like, or in many parts of European forests, it's totally not the same like, for example, in Brazil, where we have really big areas deforested. We have very, very small areas which are deforested and are forested in Europe. So you need this very, very high level of accuracy. And this might be the most demanding issue. So I know that many countries on the national scale work on these forest maps. And they know how much work this is, and it's not easy to automatize it fully. To say the other way around, for Austria, it took us, I don't know, maybe 10 years of workload from persons. It was not 10 years, but it took the volume which was done to create one really accurate picture of the forests in Austria. And we know that the deforestation and the forestation can only be assessed on this level for the Austrian case. And I'm very sure this is the same for very many others. So I am a bit skeptic that this can be done with a normal, I don't know, 10-meter resolution on the European scale. I guess this will fail from my point of view. What we can see with 10 meters, of course, is forest management, as I explained it. That's what you can see very, very clearly. But these changing borders for, I don't know, 10 meters left, 10 meters right, this is the real situation we have in Austria. That's the main part of afforestation and deforestation. It's on a very, very small scale level. Of course, we have larger areas as well, but this is not the main issue. So yeah, it will be very complicated, and you will need very detailed, normally national-based maps if you want to address this.
Thank you, and the discussions will continue in the future on this issue. Alexandra, would you have perhaps a last question, or we go with two last questions and then we come to the final words?
Yeah. Okay, fine. Yes, I would have one question related to Raphael. So how about the old growth forests? So given that data on old growth forests is very scattered and fragmented in Europe, how do you foresee possibilities to enhance old growth forest monitoring?
Yeah, thanks. So as I was saying in the chat, the Commission is currently developing new European definitions for primary forest and for old growth forest stands, and with that, guidelines for their reporting and their mapping in Europe. And the idea is to have very clear guidelines that are really actionable in the field, and then launch a EU-wide mapping initiative to finally know where these primary forest and old growth forest stands are. Of course, once we agree, and this is what a definition is for, what they are, at least in the EU. Yeah, and then so the plan is really to be able to map all of them in Europe in light of the strict protection which we plan for in the EU biodiversity strategy.
Thank you.
So, yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thomas, a last question. Do we still have one?
Yes, there was a question general question regarding the harmonization, if there are any problems between the northern and southern European countries. Not addressed specifically to someone, but maybe Clemens.
Oh yeah, I can try to do my best. Of course, there are difficulties because forest looks totally different. So maybe the question could be the other way around. Is it necessary to harmonize everything between these two different ecosystems? And I would say no, it's not necessarily, because there are specificities in Northern Europe and in Southern Europe. For example, if you look at the tree species, I'm not aware, sorry now for the northern countries, but maybe it's 10 tree species in the very high north, and maybe it's 250 tree species in the very south of Europe. So that's something where you cannot harmonize it when you look at tree species diversity, for example. Good luck. So you always the south will be very green and the north will be very red. Of course, we can find solutions for this, but I would say we should not think that there is really a need to harmonize everything. It's not, because we have really very, very different ecosystem, and we have to stick on this as well, and not just harmonize everything and then everything is in the middle somewhere of Europe or something like this. This doesn't make any sense from my point of view. I do not know if it is answered the question, but Johannes has also ideas on this. Maybe.
Yes, no, I just answered that question to some degree, I hope, in the chat, but I think a harmonization to use these data together is of course possible for many variables, but of course, but not a standardization. A standardization to make it equal, to make the measurement methods equal over all countries, that I agree wouldn't make much sense. But I mean, Clemens, you have led so many projects where you have shown that harmonization, the harmonized use of NFI data is of course very well possible. I guess that's what we can say. Yeah.
Isia, go ahead.
Okay, just to complement that, to say that we have succeeded to harmonize many variables in Europe that are common for all of us, like growing stock or food available for supply, or well, there are many of them, even the growth in the last times. So there are many variables that can be, of course, harmonized, although the ecosystems are not so, not all of them, and the variables may change, as you have seen, because the risk or the conflicts are different. But there are many variables that can be assessed.
Thank you. I think that answered very well the question. I'm afraid that we have to stop here the panel discussions, but we see there's a lot of need for further discussion, for cooperation. So thank you very much. All the panelists for participating, answer the questions. I'm sure that you will be available also by email, hopefully, if somebody has a question. So I think that will be then dealt with later off. I would also like to thank Alexandra and Thomas for co-chairing this panel discussion with me. Now I would kindly ask Kari de Korhonen from Lukka for the closing words of this seminar. Kari, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Markus, and thank you for all of you for excellent presentations and very lively discussion. And of course, to me, most of this what I heard was not new to me. There was this presentations on the National Forest Inventories and what kind of data they can produce, and how these data are used in different kind of decision making cases. And then we heard about this national or European level cooperation, how, and the good examples how National Forest Inventories have worked together to produce information that is very relevant for climate-related policies or for monitoring biodiversity, for example. And then we heard also about this Pathfinder project that will further develop the capacity of European National Forest Inventories in producing policy-relevant harmonized data and information. But then I think until today I have this understanding that there is one critical element that is missing to establish a European forest monitoring system, and that missing is the governance element that Johannes, for example, mentioned. And so in my understanding, to really make this European forest monitoring to fly, we need organizations that have clear mandate for this monitoring. They need budget for doing this work, and possibly there is a need for legislative actions. Definitely we need responsible organizations and people to establish the European forest monitoring. Then from the Commission presentations, I was very glad to hear that there is actually already ongoing work to deal with this governance issue. There are proposals for legislative or work, at least ongoing or starting for legislative proposals and plans for establishing an observatory. I only hope that these initiatives will develop in such a way that member states' national forest inventories will have the necessary resources to produce harmonized and in some cases even standardized data for European level policy making and monitoring needs. What will happen then after this webinar? I assume that the discussion between EU Commission and ENFIN network will continue. This was just one step in a series of discussions. We are planning to summarize the findings from this webinar, probably as a blog text. We will do that within a few days. And I suppose that we can inform when we have finished that this kind of summary. We can inform all you participants with an email that kind of summary is now available in published form. From my side, on behalf of Luke, I want to thank all participants, all presenters, moderator, and other people that have made it possible to arrange this webinar. Thank you. This webinar is closed.